So, we talked earlier about how JMU had an impressive season in 2023 and also in 2022 for that matter. But obviously, with success, especially when you're a G5, there's always some change that usually follows. And it's usually in the form of losing your head coach. So, you guys lost your head coach and virtually all the coaching staff to Indiana this offseason. They do bring in Bob Chesney, who was previously the head coach at Holy Cross. What can you tell us about Coach Chesney and what he brings to the table for the Dukes?
Yeah, his resume is good. I mean, his track record is good. He's now been at the Division III, Division II, FCS level. He won big everywhere he's been, and at places that hadn't really won before. He comes to JMU and he's getting that shot at the FBS level now, and also probably the first time in his career that he's come in taking over a place where they've been winning, and maybe they're ahead of their peers in some things as far as like resources and facilities and things like that. So I think just thinking about it that way, you've got to expect he should be able to continue to have some success at JMU. Now, he's never coached quite at this high level. JMU's coming off an 11-win season, which is something that's going to be hard to match on a year in, year out basis. Things kind of clicked together perfectly last year. So, whether or not there's some growing pains, it's hard to say, but I think it was a really, really good hire on JMU's part to try to continue to build the momentum that the program has.
Yeah, I think JMU's done a really good job, like in recent history anyway, of coaching hires. At some point, you got to wonder, like, when does that string of luck kind of run out? But maybe this time it'll stick again.
Yeah, I mean, and you talk about that, and I don't know if it's always luck. There's a lot of it that has to do with kind of the culture of the school. They had an athletic director, Jeff Bourne, who was there for 25 years, and he had local ties and didn't look to move on. He made some really, really good hires, and football, basketball, across the board. He was good at hiring coaches. Now he just retired. They bring in Matt Roan from Eastern Kentucky. So it's it's up in the air, kind of what he does to kind of continue things. So far, he's made a good impression. But we'll wait and see. The good thing for him is he probably has a couple of years before he has to make a big hire again. We'll see, but hopefully they'll keep the guys in place for a little while.
I'm talking about coaching changes. I mean, and we were talking about other sports earlier. Basketball, we're gonna have a new coach, right? And
yeah.
So, yeah, big changes there at JMU across all sports. But getting back to football, as that often happens when you get that new head coach, it means new assistants and coordinators. JMU is no difference in that regard. Coach Chesney brings over Dean Kennedy with him from Holy Cross, where he served as an offensive coordinator. Can you describe the type of offense that Coach Chesney and Kennedy will bring with them and plan to run there at JMU?
It's not particularly easy to just describe it because they've done different things throughout the years where they've been. And, last year they had, one of the most dynamic dual threat quarterbacks in the country at Holy Cross. And so the offense really, it gravitated towards that. They had a lot of designed run plays for the quarterback. They threw the ball some, but, he had almost as many rushing yards as passing yards there at Holy Cross. But it hasn't always been like that for Holy Cross. And Chesney's teams, Kennedy's teams in general, they'll kind of adjust the play calling in particular and the designs of things to their personnel. And they're going to have a fairly deep running back room going into this season. At least it looks that way. And they bring in Dylan Morse, who I'm sure we'll talk about some more, as a quarterback, who's not the same kind of dual threat guy that they had, up there in Massachusetts. So it'll look a little different. And I think they're going to throw the ball more. I think it'll be more of a balanced run pass, but not so much with the design quarterback runs as we saw from Holy Cross the last couple of years.
So speaking of the quarterback, we'll move on over to there. They lose last season's starter and Sun Belt Player of the Year in Jordan McLeod, who transferred to Texas State. They brought in Dylan Morse from Washington, who you mentioned just a moment ago, and they return Alonzo Barnett III, Brett Griffiths, and Billy Atkins. How did the quarterback room look and shape up in the spring?
It looks like it's definitely Dylan Morris's job to lose. He's a guy who comes in who It's really kind of an interesting background for him. He was a starter early on in his career at Washington and does okay. He does pretty well in a shortened COVID season where they only played, I think, maybe 6 or 7 games. He ended up being, honorable mention all Pac-12. So he got off to a good start there. Then Michael Penix comes in to Washington, is having, back-to-back Heisman caliber seasons. And so he's not getting the same kind of playing time. He transfers out. He arrives at JMU. So, we'll see what he can kind of do at the Sun Belt level. But he brings experience. He brings things that I think, will probably end up winning him the job. Behind him, I think they probably got to feel a little bit better than they did in the last couple of years as far as their backup quarterback, just because, Alonzo Barnett has a little bit more experience. I think the change in coaching staff is probably good for him as far as like a fresh start. And I would expect him to probably be the number 2. He actually started the season opener last year. Yep. He looked good in through spring ball, through fall camp last year, and then really struggled in the season opener, his first college action really. He struggled and never really kind of got over it. And I think like maybe the change of pace, a change of scenery with a new coaching staff potentially gives him a better opportunity to come in and maybe clear his head and be the number 2 guy. But, Billy Atkins also has some experience. Brett Griffiths, that name's kind of known. His brother was a starter at Wake Forest. He maybe doesn't have the same level of arm as the other guys, but he's a smart kid who I think if they end up having to put him in, he's a guy I don't think you expect to make too many mistakes. But it really looks like it's Morris's team to lead going into the fall.
So, we alluded to this earlier about Morris, and he's not really a dual threat. Not to say he can't move, but he's not going to rush for 1,400 yards like Matt Sluka did. And then with Barnett kind of being the backup, as you mentioned, their styles are very different. And so, like from an offensive perspective, I realize they can adjust, but you would think maybe they don't want to change things too much. So like how are they dealing with that contrasting styles with those 2 quarterbacks?
Yeah, they're different, and Barnett's definitely more of a runner, I would say. He's still I don't think he would be like a Sluka type, rushing for over 1,000 yards, but there might be more designed run, RPO type things if they go with Barnett. So I think that was part of the reason he won the job early last year too, is that he looked really good in those like RPO situations and things in practice. It didn't translate to his opportunity in the game, and they kind of, pulled the cord on him really fast, probably knowing that they had talent behind him. But yeah, I think it's like I talked about earlier. I think what you'll see from the coaching staff is they will adjust things based on
if needed, I guess.
But at the same time, your playbook is your playbook to a certain degree. It's hard to completely change directions in the middle of the season if you have to change quarterbacks. But I'm guessing they'll have some things that both guys can do well.
Moving on to the running game, which had its share of success in 2023, but they lose their top 5 rushers from a year ago in Keon Black, Tyson Lawton, Latrell Palmer, but they rebuilt that room through the transfer portal, bringing in 1,000-yard rusher from North Texas, Ayo Adeyi, former 4-star recruit, and George Pettaway from North Carolina, and Tyler Purdy follows that stuff over from Holy Cross. How is this running back room looking here in the spring?
Yeah, well, you mentioned the 3 guys that looked good in the spring, and I think will be on the field a lot. George Pettaway, at least in the spring game, he looked really good. He's got a ton of speed. I think he's a guy who's going to get a lot of carries. But Ayo Adeyi is the kind of the proven guy. He's somebody that they gave, I think, a lot of attention to. Even just sometimes you can tell what the coaches are thinking by like who they choose to come talk to the media after practice and things like that. And he's a guy who's been out there, and I think is going to be a key to the offense. And then Tyler Purdy, who you mentioned, he's the only guy on the roster that they list as athlete rather than another position, which was pretty interesting coming out of the spring game. He's a guy who I think, you'll see him in the backfield. You might see him in the slot other times. He he's a bigger guy. He can maybe be a short yardage guy, but he's also going to catch the ball. So it'll be a different look with the running backs than it has been in previous years. 2 years ago, with we talked off air about how hard it is to pronounce the names. Percy Ajay Obase. I always have to stop to get his name right. But he was their featured back a couple of years ago, and they were pretty solid in the running back department there. Last year was a little bit disappointing, maybe in like how they struggled to get a lot of yards after contact from their running backs. So I think that's one area where I would say no guarantees, but like it's almost expected they're going to be better than they were last year. Running back is one place where things are looking pretty good.
So former head coach Kurt Sinetti always seemed to take more of that committee running back approach. What have you seen from the new staff, and kind of what do you expect if we're going to see a healthy dose of the running game? Are we going to see a workhorse running back, a committee approach, 50-50, 40, 60-40?
I think committee, like, because all three of the guys we mentioned looked good in the spring. They look capable. They do some slightly different things. But, I would expect it to be sort of a committee type of situation. Maybe Debbie, just with his experience and his proven track record, gets to nod more often than not. But I think all three of those guys are going to get touches.
So JMU last year was very successful passing the ball, featuring 2,000-yard receivers. Unfortunately, they lose them both, and Elijah Surratt, who followed the staff to Indiana, and then Reggie Brown, who graduated. They also lose third leading receiver Phoenix Sproles. They return Tajee Hudson, Ymir Knight, Amarian Dollison, Maxwell Moss, Troy Lewis, and others. They bring in Cam Ross from UConn, Nakai Poole from Mississippi State. How did the wide receiver room look in the spring?
It's going to be, like you said, it's going to look a lot different. Some of those guys, did kind of stand out. Nakai Poole ended up leaving after spring ball because, I'm not sure he was as high on the depth chart as he was maybe expecting coming from Mississippi State. So he's gone, but Tajee Hudson had a really good spring. I think his role probably increases quite a bit going into next year. Omarion Dollison has shown flashes at times, was just kind of buried behind some of those guys last year. Those guys definitely have a chance to step up and get more done. To expect 2,000-yard receivers again, which they've had over the past couple of years, I don't know if that's necessarily reasonable to expect, because I just don't know if they're going to put up as many passing yards. I think it's going to be a little bit more balanced. So statistically they might not look as good, but they do seem to kind of have the spots filled anyway. And they were really, really good at the wide receiver spot last year. I mean, we'll continue to probably say that almost every position group we break down, they were good there last year. And, they might not be as good this year, but they do seem to like have some guys who can compete, and they might not rely on them as much as they have in the past.
So they recently brought in a couple of more additions through the transfer portal. They brought in, or they got commitments anyway, from Breon Penny from San Diego State and Amarian Granger from Old Dominion. Do you think either of those two might have a shot at kind of cracking the starting rotation?
Yeah, I mean, I think they have a shot. I think it's pretty open to competition going into the fall, just at that position. And they bring those guys in for a reason, right? They're guys who have the G5 experience, and you didn't put up huge numbers, but have been on the field. If nothing else, it adds to the depth, which
sure.
I think, but having not seen a ton of those guys, it's hard to say. But I think, I think they were probably told coming in, hey, there's an opportunity to come in and compete for playing time, and they'll do that.
I realize here it is late May, and we got a lot can change before the first game at the end of August, 1st of September. But who do you think, if you had to pick who the starting receivers were against Charlotte in week 1, who do you think that might be?
Depending on what kind of set they go out in, I mean, I would probably guess Hudson, Dollison, maybe a Cam Ross. But, you might see something strange where they got a couple guys in the backfield and, like we said, Tyler Purdy in the slot or something. So
Sure.
Things could look weird at times. Things could look a lot different than the kind of formations we saw last year, where a lot of times it was, 3 or 4 wide receivers out there. But I think those guys are at least kind of guaranteed to get snaps, whether they're starting or not. It's hard to say, but I think we'll see a lot of those guys.
Gotcha.
Well, let's take a look at this tight end room. Can you describe for us how you expect the tight ends to be utilized in this Chesney Kennedy offense, and how much of a role will they have in the passing game?
Yeah, I mean, their role in the passing game will be there. They might be used like in the running game as blockers even more than in the past. And that's to say, a guy like Zach Horton last year who had a really good year was a really good blocker, and he was a good blocker downfield. But they've got some size with their tight ends this year. Kai Wright was a guy we talked a little bit about offline, who is just a huge dude, and I think he might get a little bit more of an opportunity than he got last year. And Taylor Thompson coming in as a transfer guy who I think is probably going to be on the field a lot. He seems to be a good pass catcher. But similar to talking about the wide receivers, I don't know for sure how prolific they're going to be numbers wise compared to last year and the year before that, where they had guys at those positions putting up big stats, getting the all conference honors because of that. And I don't know if they're going to look for those guys to be as prolific maybe as in years past.
And then we talked about Kai Wright and Taylor Thompson, but they also bring in Logan Kyle from Vanderbilt this summer. Did anybody step up to assume that tight end 1 role there in the spring, or is that going to be a position battle come in the fall?
I think it's possibly a position battle, and I think it's a position where you may see a lot of guys rotating in and out, based on different things. But like I said, we didn't see everybody in the spring who's going to be in there battling for that. So it's another one of those positions where it's kind of hard to guess exactly who's going to start. But if I was going to put odds on it right now, I'd say, Taylor Thompson's probably the guy I would guess is on the field for the first snap. But again, I'm not sure how much that first snap matters as much as like who's getting what percentage of the snaps. And that could change based on a lot of factors.
So we've talked about a lot of position groups on the offense and all the personnel losses. The offensive line, though, seems to have fared much better compared to the other groups, losing only 2 starters from a year ago in Tyler Stevens and Carter Miller. They return Cole Potts, Tanner Morris, Tyshawn Wyatt, Josh Toner, and others. How did that unit look in the spring?
It's good, like you would expect. I mean, and it's not that they're necessarily going full contact a lot in the spring and everything, but I mean it's an experienced group. You talked about losing the entire staff. Basically, the one guy who they thought was going to be back from the staff was Damian Roboleski, who was the offensive line coach, and he was the interim coach during the bowl game and everything. He ended up moving on to Maryland too. Like he had a lot of reasons, with his son's health to want to stay in this general vicinity. So he didn't go to Indiana, but then, the Big Ten money is hard to pass up for anybody. And he ends up at Maryland. That's a tough loss, but then, they bring in people who can replace them. The staff looks really good, but that's one thing where they might be a little different. They lose the continuity that otherwise they've got a lot of guys who have played a lot of snaps together, which is what you want in the offensive line. And, like you said, that's one area where there's not going to be a ton of new faces and things are going to look much more similar than pretty much everywhere else on the offense.
All right, Shane, if you had to pick an offensive player to have a breakout type season here in 2024, who are you picking?
That's a tough one, but it could be a Dylan Morris where maybe people have forgotten about him having that good year, back in 2021 for Washington. partially because they didn't play a ton of games and partially because it's been a while. But, if he ends up being one of the better quarterbacks in the Sun Belt, I wouldn't be shocked. On the other hand, I think people are looking for it maybe from AOAB, as we talk about running back. I think George Pettaway has a chance to be really good too. Maybe a guy who makes the big plays and, the long runs, the breakaway speed. So I don't know if they're going to have anybody who like just puts up ridiculous stats like they've had in recent years. But, those are two guys who I think maybe by midseason people could be like, oh, wow, I kind of forgot about him. And, even though they came in with some accolades when they came into college.
Before we move on to the defensive side of the ball, something I was thinking about, here in the spring, did you notice any rapport being built up with Dylan Morris and a particular wide receiver in the room?
I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, Omarion Dollison maybe is a guy who I think he did it some last year too with Jordan McLeod in a similar situation where the guy was coming in as a transfer and hadn't been around a lot. And but they had some, prior history, and I think they connected pretty early on. And I think, just a guy who's been around for a while, Dollison is maybe one of those guys who recognizes, hey, it's also sort of on the wide receivers to help with this leadership and this transition and everything. And they're two guys who, when they talked about, who they connected with, I think there was, some chemistry there.